In 1964, the Olympic Games were held in Tokyo. Sri Lanka sent a contingent to participate in the Games, and for the 10,000-meter race, they sent a runner by the name of Karunananda. Karunananda. Say that real fast. The race was won by a U.S. runner, an underdog, Billy Mills, and which in and of itself is an amazing story. It marked the only time the U.S. has ever won that event. Now, when Mills finished his 25 laps around the track, Karunananda was only 4 laps behind. He'd been lapped 4 times, and most thought, well, he'll give up running. But he continued to run. The spectators, seeing him running all by himself, began to laugh, and some began to jeer and heckle him, but he kept running. And when the spectators finally realized he was going to finish the race, some of them began to cheer. They began to encourage him. And on the final lap, the applause grew louder, as he finished the race. He was later asked about this, and he said, "The Olympic spirit is not to win, but to take part, and so I completed my rounds." His job wasn't to finish or to win. I mean, he wanted to win, but he wanted to finish. More than anything else, he just wanted to finish. Now, it should also be said, he didn't feel good that day. So that didn't help him as he ran, but he completed his race. We are in Hebrews chapter 12 this morning, and we continue making our way through this book that encourages us to remain focused on Jesus. Focused on Jesus. And in this chapter, the author of Hebrews tells us that we too are in a race. We are in a race that we must continue to run, and we need to finish. Now, chapter 12 starts with the word therefore. Therefore. It's an important word. And it lets us know that everything he is about to say is based on what he has just said. The author of Hebrews has been encouraging his readers to remain in the faith and not to fall away, not to return to the traditions of Judaism. There are so many distractions in life, so many things that would take our eyes off of Jesus, our focus off of this race that we are running. Even as there were distractions then, and so we must maintain our focus on Jesus. Now, why Jesus? Well, throughout the book, the author has reminded his readers, reminded us that Jesus is greater. Jesus is greater than the prophets through whom God spoke. Jesus is greater than the angels, God's messengers and servants. Jesus is greater than Moses, the great lawgiver who delivered his people out of Egyptian bondage. Jesus is greater than the priests, the Jewish priests, and even the Jewish high priest, because Jesus is now our high priest who serves in heaven, not in a temple made with hands, but a temple in heaven. Therefore, we need to keep our faith in Jesus, because Jesus is greater. I've heard that if you're lost out in the cold and you can't find a place to stay warm, that the first thing you need to do is stay awake. Right? If you're going to survive the night in freezing temperatures, you need to stay awake, because the body's natural inclination is to sleep, so you conserve energy, right? So you can stay warm, but that's not what happens. As soon as you fall asleep, you'll freeze to death, and so you got to stay awake. Well, how do you stay awake if your body keeps telling you to go to sleep? Well, you keep moving. You keep moving. Falling asleep is perhaps the greatest danger for Christians as well. Falling asleep in our faith, not keeping moving. We read numerous verses in the Bible encouraging us to stay awake. For example, in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 14, we read, "This is why it is said, 'Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you.'" There's this command, instruction to the church in Sardis in Revelation. Wake up, strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God. We're told to wake up, to stay awake, because we can't continue in our race if we're sleeping. So we got to stay awake. We got to keep in it. And there's this danger of drifting from the faith if we're not paying attention, if we drift off and go to sleep. And so the author of Hebrews encourages us to run this race that God has set before us. And to do that, we need two things. First, we need to train, and we need a trainer. The author of Hebrews says we need to train, and we need a trainer. First, there's the training. You know, if we're going to go into our spiritual race, if we're going to continue in this spiritual race, we need to train. And concerning this training, Paul told Timothy that physical training is good for you, but spiritual training, even better. Yeah, you know people who train physically, go down to the gym every day or several times a week. I'd like to say I do that, but you can look at me and see I don't. But it's important. It's important to stay in shape. Some of you will remember an elder we had here, Raymond Batista. Raymond Batista is the only person I've ever met who the doctor said, you know, you really should do less exercise. I mean, even in his 90s, he continued to exercise every morning. Physical exercise, staying in shape is important. But Paul says, you know what's more important? Spiritual exercise. Spiritual exercise is important. Because our bodies are going to die. But our spiritual training benefits not only this life, but the life to come. And so concerning his own spiritual training, Paul wrote to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 24 through 27. He says, "Do you not know that in a race, all runners run, but only one gets the prize? So run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." He's talking about our spiritual training, our need to discipline ourselves. So what do we need to do for spiritual training? Well, here's what the author of Hebrews has to say. Hebrews chapter 12, beginning with verse 1. He says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." Now, so the author of Hebrews lists some actions that we should take. And first of all, he says we should remember the examples that we have of those who have gone before us. Examples like the one we found in Hebrews chapter 11. Last week, we saw examples of what faith looks like. You know, if the 17 people he mentioned in that chapter, and many more that he alluded to, who lived long before Jesus, if they could remain faithful despite the difficulties they endured, how much more should we be able to remain faithful in light of all that Jesus has done for us? They were looking forward to Jesus. They didn't know what that meant. They just had faith that God would send the Messiah. But now we have the Messiah. We know what happened. Jesus came and died for us. we know that we have the promise of eternal life. And because they made it, they are our example that we can make it too, if we stay awake and focused and stay in the race. Second, we need to get rid of everything that slows us down. If you ever watch runners in a race, they wear as little as possible and the clothes as light as possible, right? They want to wear the lightest shoes they can find, the lightest shirts they can find. They don't want anything to weigh them down so that they can run faster. And likewise, the author of Hebrews instructs us to get rid of whatever's going to slow us down, and particularly sins. Now, the NIV says the sin, as if there's a particular sin. There's not the definite article in there. It says get rid of the easily entangling sin. In other words, there's not a specific sin, but whatever sin is in your life. We all have different temptations. What's a temptation for you may not be a temptation for me, and vice versa. But what he's saying is, the greatest sin in your life, the greatest temptation. And he says you need to deal with it. He says you need to get rid of whatever slows you down, whatever is in your life that prevents you from growing as close to God as you otherwise would. Third, we need to persevere. We've all faced difficulties. We've all faced injustices. Life isn't easy, nor is it fair. Things happen to us that we don't deserve. But still, we got to persevere. We got to continue in the race. If we only run our race when it's easy, we only run our race when things are going our way, we won't get very far. Because there's always something that's happening. And then fourth, he says to focus on Jesus. Jesus is called the author and the perfecter of our faith. In other words, it's Jesus who began it and Jesus who's going to finish it. Paul put it this way to the Philippians in Philippians 1 verse 6. He says that he is very confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. God's working in you. God's working in you. He started it. He's going to finish it. And so we need to look to Jesus. But we also look to Jesus because of what he's done. And we're told that Jesus endured the suffering of the cross, the shame that went with it, because of the joy that awaited him. What was that joy? Well, it wasn't the beating, the flogging. It wasn't the crucifixion that was a joy. It was the joy that came after that. And what was it? Well, was it the fact that after the crucifixion, he would rise from the dead, go to heaven, and once more be with his Father? Well, that may have been part of it, but I don't think that was it either. I think that the joy that was set before him was the ability to tell us that we are now forgiven. We are now forgiven, and we can now go to heaven to be with him. And that joy for him started while he was still on the cross, when he could look at that criminal hanging beside him and say, "Today you will be with me in paradise." The joy set before him was our salvation. And so Jesus went through the pain, the suffering, the shame, because of the salvation it would bring us. Therefore, when we are tempted to slow down or drift away, focus on Jesus. Focus on Jesus and what he has done for us. We need to train for this spiritual race by remembering those who've gone before us, getting rid of sin that slows us down, focusing on Jesus. But we also need a trainer. I remember a quote by Dallas Cowboy coach Tom Landry about leadership. And he said, define leadership this way. He said, leadership is getting someone to do what they don't want to do to achieve what they want to achieve. Making somebody do what they don't want to do so they can achieve what they want to achieve. If you've ever played sports and you've had a coach, that's a good definition of coach, is it not? of a coach. I remember playing soccer and the coach making us run lots of laps. At the end of practice, when we were tired, it was not fun. We didn't want to do it. So why did he make us run laps? So we could achieve what we wanted to achieve, which was win games. And he knew the way to win games is to be in good shape. So at the end of practice, when we were all ready to hit the showers and go home, nope, you got to run laps. And we did them. Ultimately, our coach, our trainer, is God. And here's what author of Hebrews says about God's training, verse 4. He says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And you have completely forgotten, have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you're not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best. But God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Now, authors will repeat words that are important. What word was repeated in this passage, in these verses? Discipline. Discipline. He repeats it 10 times in 10 verses. It's important. Now, when we hear the word discipline, we often think of it negatively. I remember my parents disciplining me, and that discipline often involved punishment, occasionally a spanking. It was never fun, right? It was never fun. To say in verse 11 that it's not pleasant is an understatement. However, even then I knew that my parents' goal was, or at least I hope it was to make me a better person, right? To teach me, to train me. God always disciplines us for our good because he wants what is best for us, and he knows what is best for us. Our parents discipline us the best they can, but no one's perfect. God is perfect. And so his discipline is always right. It is always perfect. So we may not like being disciplined, but we can be certain that God's discipline is always for our good. And so the author of Hebrews makes a couple of other points about God's discipline. First, God disciplines us because he loves us. One parenting lesson I remember is never discipline a child when you're mad, right? Never discipline when you're angry, because you're likely to do something you'll later regret. Let it calm down. God never disciplines us out of anger. He disciplines us out of his great love for us, and only because he loves us. Second, God disciplines us because we're his children. You ever seen a child in the store misbehaving and you would have liked to have disciplined them? But you can't discipline them. They're not your child. We are God's children. And the author of Hebrews says we know that because he disciplines us. It's proof that he loves us. In last year's Peachtree Road Race in Atlanta, the leader of the women's race made a wrong turn. What's worse is she made the turn within eyesight of the finish line. She's running along. She's following a police car that's in police vehicle that's in front of her. And so just at the last minute, before they got to the finish line, the police vehicle turned out of the way and made a right turn. Well, she'd been following the vehicle and she wasn't paying attention, and she just kept following the vehicle and made that turn. She won the race the year before, but last year she lost because she made a wrong turn within eyesight of the finish line. And as a result, she lost the $10,000 prize. She took her eyes off the goal, the finish line. Now, don't you think at that moment she would have liked to have had someone say, wait a minute, get back on track, you made a wrong turn, right? A coach, a trainer, somebody there to help her. Sometimes we need God's correcting hand to keep us on track. And we may not like the discipline, but that's what it's for. And if we don't like the discipline, think about the alternative. If God's not disciplining us, what happens? Well, what happens, Paul described it to the Romans. He said that at some point, if we continue to resist God's discipline, and we decide, I'm going to ignore God's discipline, I'm going to continue in my sin, God's just going to say, okay, then here, continue in your sin. And he's going to make it even easier for us to continue in our sin. I think of the story of the Israelites out in the wilderness complaining about their food. God is providing for them and they're complaining. We want meat. And so God says, okay, I'll give you some meat. I'll give you quail. In fact, I'm going to give you so much quail that it's going to start coming out of your noses, right? You're going to be sick of it by the time you get finished. If we don't like God's discipline, right, then what God does is just turns us loose, lets us do whatever we want to do. It's not better. It's the only alternative. Why does God need to discipline us? Most often it's because of sin. And so the author asks, how many have shed blood in their attempt to resist sin? I mean, if you attempted to resist sin so that to the point that you had to shed blood. I never have. I don't know anyone that has. And the author of Hebrews isn't telling us, suggesting that we do that. He's just saying, if you want to live for God, you want to live holy lives, well, how much are you doing to stay in the race? Are you listening to God's discipline? And so the author of Hebrews writes in verses 12 and 13, therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. Once again, we find the word therefore, right? Because of what he's just said about staying focused on Jesus, receiving discipline. What are we to do? We are to stay in the race. We're to do what we can to stay in the race. One commentator put it this way. He says, God is not only a disciplining father, but also a demanding coach who pushes us to our limits and requires our lives to be disciplined. And we may not feel like we can continue on, but God gives us the strength we need to stay in the race. The 1980 Boston Marathon had a likely and unexpected winner in the women's race. Rosie Ruiz came out of nowhere, literally, to win the race. No one knew who she was. Most races like that, you've seen them win in their past, and so they know who they are. No one had ever heard of her. And when she was interviewed, her story began to fall apart. They would ask her questions about her training, and she didn't even know what they meant. Here's what happened. She started the race with everyone else. They got into the race, and she slipped out of the race, got on the subway, rode the subway to the finish line, got off, got back into the race, and she won the race. Record time. What's funny is you watch the race and the finish line, and she crosses it and almost collapses. I mean, she really sold her part, like she had run the whole thing. She had not. There is no shortcut in the race of life. You don't win like that. And so we need training. We need training. We need to train ourselves. As Paul said, we need to discipline ourselves, but we also need a trainer. We need God's help. And it may not be fun at the time, but we know that we need it. And so we are to stay awake. We're to keep moving. We're to focus on what Jesus has done for us and accept the training that God gives us. This morning we're going to sing our invitation and we invite you to come. If you've never made that decision to follow Jesus, to get in the race, we invite you to do so. To give your heart, your life to him, to be baptized in his name. That Jesus died not because we were good enough and deserved it. Jesus died because he loves us. And so he offers salvation as a free gift to us all. All we have to do is receive it. And so we invite you to come if you've never made that decision. Won't you come as we stand?